Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. This is the Developing Leaders in Manufacturing webinar. I have Thomas Evans with me from Training Logic, who will be our presenter for today. So this webinar in particular is brought to you by CLTCC and MEPAL. I'm your host, Kayla Gentry. I'm the Manufacturing Outreach Manager for the Manufacturing Extension Partnership of Louisiana, which is a mouthful, so we like to say MEPAL. We're a couple minutes from starting. I'll give people a couple more minutes to sign on. But in the meantime, this is our first webinar of 2021. Please be on the lookout for more. We are working on developing some webinars for more best practices for manufacturers. So as a participant, you will be in listen-only mode through this webinar. You do have a chance for question and answers at the end. We will be taking those, at the very end of the webinar, but please feel free to put your questions in that chat box or the question box in your side panel. And like I said, we'll go through those at the end of the webinar. Also, this is a live webinar event. I will be posting this on our YouTube channel. If you missed it or if you want to send it to somebody else, please feel free to do so. And like I said, that'll be on our YouTube channel for you to grab. So I guess I'll give it a few more minutes, let a few more people sign on here, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, everyone. And for those of you just signing on, thanks for joining us. I hope everybody is doing okay after this crazy weather we've had in Louisiana. I know, Thomas, you're up in the northern region of the state, so glad you're doing okay and glad you could be with us today. So we're going to get started. This is the Developing Leaders in Manufacturing. And I just want to give a little bit of information about our organization, which is MEPAL. So the Manufacturing Extension Partnership is actually part of a national network under the National Institute of Standards and Technology that works with U.S. manufacturers to create and retain jobs, increase profits, save time and money, develop new customers, and expand into new markets. So as you can see by national network, we do mean there is an MEP in every state, as well as Puerto Rico. MEPAL is also part of the Louisiana Community and Technical College System, or LCTCS. As such, we're better able to cover the state of Louisiana with project managers located at community colleges throughout the state. CLTCC, as well as other community colleges throughout the state, offer services to manufacturers, which help to meet the advanced needs of the manufacturing industry and produce a highly skilled and reliable workforce. So the webinar today will be presented by Thomas Evans of Training Logic. And just a little bit about Thomas. Evans started his career over 30 years ago with the Dale Carnegie Training Systems. In 1988, he accepted a national training manager position with Williamette Industries, a diversified wood products company with more than 14,000 employees. Thomas was responsible for the design and delivery of the multi-level soft skills training programs and leadership succession development across the nation. In 2002, he founded Training Logic, a training organization which employs a wide array of skilled and experienced trainers who have extensive expertise in the corporate environment. So I'll go ahead and give it over to our presenter today, Thomas Evans, and he will walk you through succession development. So Thomas, let me go ahead and change it over to you.
Okay.
Perfect. Looks great.
So we're all good? Well,
All
good
good.
morning, gang. And thank you for dialing in. You know, this has been an interesting subject matter. The last few years, succession planning has, if it hadn't hit the top level or most frequented topic of discussion for companies, it is very close to that. It's an interesting topic today. Appreciate Kayla helping coordinate all this and giving us the introduction. You know, my whole career has been built around training and development. Is for the most part, that's what we've been doing. And, you know, for a lot of years, as we looked at succession development, it really kind of got into, well, who's next and who's standing in line. But what a significant difference we're seeing today. You know, I remember, and this has been, I think 2 summers ago, maybe 3 summers ago, I was up in a paper mill in South Alabama, and we were doing some leadership development training. And it was an all-day training that we had set up for all the leaders. So all of them were going through this 8 hours of leadership development. And in about lunchtime, just before lunch, the plant manager who was sitting in that first class came up to me and he said, Thomas, we're going to need an hour and a half for lunch. And I said, an hour and a half? I've never been in a plant that took an hour and a half for lunch. Why do we need an hour and a half? And he said, because we're celebrating a guy's tenure here at the mill. I said, well, heck, if we're celebrating his tenure, how long has he been here? Now, this is going to blow your mind. He was celebrating his 70th year on the job. Now, I know this is a listen-only presentation, but I'm hoping that you're absolutely shocked by that, because I was totally shocked by that. And I said, 70 years? And look, sometimes the first thought that enters my mind is the first one that comes out my mouth. And I said, how old is that guy? And about that time, he walked into the room and he heard my question and he said, I'm 85 years old. So you do the math. When did he start? When he was 15 years old, he walked into that mill. Now, can you imagine the changes that guy has seen in the world of work? And I had an honor to visit with him for a little while. And I asked him, I said, what was it like back then? And he chuckled a little bit and he said, you know, I can remember, he said, sometimes people here in the mill, some of them didn't wear shoes. And I said, didn't wear shoes? And the way he said it, my first impression was that people couldn't afford to buy shoes. And that was not the case. He corrected me on that. And he said, no, he said 70 years ago, he said on the wet end of the mill, which was everything was damp when they were taking the pulp and getting all the chemicals mixed ready for paper. But on the wet end of the mill, he said everybody back then had boots that had leather soles. And when you stepped on a wet concrete floor, that was like walking on ice, and they had better traction with their feet, their bare feet. And I just thought about that and thought, I could not imagine in today's world how significantly different the world of work is today, especially for someone like that has seen 70 years in the mill. So my point being this to the story, you know, we've come a long way when you talk about manufacturers and how we produce and how safe we are. I mean, there's been a number of certainly monumental changes that we've made in the mills and the facilities and the plants, but we're still a long way from being prepared and ready for succession planning. And so I wanted to bring up some points today, some ideas, all of which I want you to rob and steal. Certainly we don't want to just hoard information, but I want you to, even though it's a listen only, Kayla is set up to take questions, and we'll answer some questions at the end of the program. So I'm going to jump into PowerPoint here for just a minute. And you follow along here. Here's the first thing I want you to do. I'm going to show you a guy's picture. And I want, if you know who this is, or if you just want to take a good guess, I want you to send Kayla a message in the chat room, and I want you to tell her who you think this guy is. I'm going to give you just a minute to look at him, just to make sure that we're all ready for that. let's see here. Let me get this shared. All right, so y'all take a look at that guy. And there's not much there to Google this guy up, so I think you're probably going to be limited with technology. But I'm going to give you about 30 seconds for you to send to Kayla who you think this guy is. He looks important. Certainly you can tell that was a long time ago. But who do you think that individual is? Take about another 10 or 15 seconds if you got a guess, or if you're sitting in a conference room and have a few others around you, maybe come to a consensus, or just log your answers of who you think that individual is. All right, so you got it?
I've got a Dale Carnegie as a name.
Dale Carnegie. Well, that would have been probably back in the day. I bet this individual and Dale Carnegie might have run across each other, but it's not Dale Carnegie. Did you have any other guesses, Kaylee? Any other input?
No other guesses.
That was it?
That's
All right. Well, you know why you don't know this guy?
Ernest Shackleton?
He what?
Ernest Shackleton?
No, that's a good guess, but that's not who it is either. And I'm going to tell you why you don't know this guy. He did not have a succession plan. That was the problem. If this guy had had a succession plan, you'd have known him today. Back in the late 20s, early 30s, this guy was a household name. His name was Henry Kaiser. And man, he was in everything from shipbuilding to cement to construction. But you know, after Mr. Kaiser passed away, within 21 years after his death, everything had either been sold or gone under. And, you know, just the point being that a lot of times when you think about the longevity of your organization, it doesn't mean that it can't be highly successful with who's running it now. The question is, are you prepared to lead that organization with whoever takes their place? And so lots of things have changed. And part of that has also been our time frame and being able to get people ready. So let me throw a couple of things at you today, right? And I'm not trying to get into generational training specifically, but you know what? We got trainings that we could spend 8 hours talking about generational trainings. This is the first time in history that you've had 5 generations working in the same workforce. And that does significantly impact the succession plan for today. Now, silent generation, we don't see very many of them. I mean, every once in a while, like the guy that had 70 years in the workforce would have been what we would have considered silent generation. For many of you, you know, if you're my age and I'm 60, that silent generation would have been my parents, right? If you're younger, you know, 30s and 40s, that was your grandparents. So there's not many of the silent generation still left in the workforce. But, you know, I was in a local mill not too many years ago, and I met a guy that had been in the mill for 53 years. And I said, "What's your name?" And he said, "Jimmy." And I said, "Jimmy, how old are you?" And Jimmy was 75 at the time. He would have been the youngest of that particular generation. And so there was about 40 people in the classroom that day, and I was picking on Jimmy a little bit. And I said, "Jimmy, how many days of work have you missed?" And I'll never forget Jimmy's answer. He looked up at the ceiling and he said, "I don't know, Thomas, probably 5 or 6 days, I guess." And I knew this was going to be offensive to Jimmy, but I said it anyway. I said, 5 or 6 days this year, Jimmy? And he was offended by that. And he said, "No, I'm not talking about this year. I'm talking about the whole time." And so I picked on Jimmy a little bit. We took a break just a little while later, and I was over visiting with the HR person. His name was Mike. And Mike said, "Hey, that was funny what you were doing with Jimmy, but you want to hear something real funny? Go ask Jimmy about his overtime." So I went back to Jimmy, this 75-year-old who had been at the mill for 53 years. And I said, "Jimmy, what's this I hear about your overtime?" And he said, well, twice a week I pull a double. Now, this guy was working a day shift, but twice a week he would take on a swing shift. And they were working 8-hour shifts. So he was working 16 hours a day, 2 days a week. He'd been doing that for many, many years. And Anyway, what I didn't anticipate, and remember we're at break, he said, you know who I get my time from? I said, what do you mean who you get your time from? I didn't quite understand what he was saying. Well, he turned around and he pointed across that room, and there was a young man standing over there that was probably 19 or 20, looked like he had come right out of school and gone to work at the mill. And he didn't call him a young man. He said, you see that punk right there? And I said, I do. He said, if he can make his boat note by the third week of the month, I get 2 days from him. And then he pointed to somebody else. But everybody he pointed out was the youngest of the generations. Now, what's interesting is, and again, I'm not trying to get deep into generational training, but that silent generation was called silent because they didn't complain about anything, and they took every hour of work they could get. They lived in a time when the Depression was taking place, and they knew that if they didn't show up, there was a big population who wanted their job. And so typically that population remains silent, but most of them are no longer in the workforce. Boomer generation, there's a significant amount of boomers. But let me tell you something special about boomers. Largest population the U.S. has ever seen. Apparently after World War II, the objective was babies because there's a bunch of us. I am, I guess, what would be considered one of the youngest of the boomer generation. But I'm going to show you something in here in a chart in just a minute that looks at what happens in the next couple of 4, 5, 6 years to the boomer generation in terms of the world of work. Because if you go ask most boomers, and they would have to be born in about, some charts say 1960 would be the youngest, some say 64 would be the youngest. But if you're one of those babies born in that time frame and you go ask that individual, what's your goals in the next 3 to 5 years, almost every one of them is going to say, I'm going to retire. So you've got a lot of experience coming out of the workforce. Generation X, lots of leaders today in Generation X. We see lots of organizations run by Generation X today. But here's how I know a next generation. If I say the word Atari, their eyes light up. They were the first generation to learn this world can run electronically. They came into the boomers and they asked great questions. They were challengers. And the Generation X said to a boomer, why are we doing it that way? And the boomer had a great answer. The boomer said, we've always done it that way. Why would you ask a crazy question like that? And it would lick our pencil and write it down. Well, the Xers didn't invent social media. What they invented was things like Access and Excel, the ways to store data and be able to query data in what you needed. And so they've created organizations that are certainly far more run electronically today with a lot more technology than obviously where the boomers came from. Y generation, they were born with technology. You watch a Y generation with a cell phone, it's as if they've had it from birth. Y generation, very comfortable. Y generation is that generation also that always ask why. So they came in and they're suspicious oftentimes of the older generations, where silent generation and boomer generations were very trusting of others around them. Y is always asking how come and why. And this Z generation just coming in is going to change the needle again. But I'm not bringing all that up just to get into generations. The reason I'm bringing that up is this. When you take a look at a chart like this that looks at where we are in 2021, and you look up at the scale, look at the yellow scale that represents the boomers, you're going to see that scale from 2021 up to maybe 2028, right? Maybe 2026, somewhere in there. You start to see almost every boomer start to exit out of the workforce. So you've got a fair population of Xers, but look who's making up the biggest percentage of the workforce by the time we get up to 2030 is going to be Generation Y. It's going to make up over half of the working age population. And you can see half actually took place in 2017, 2018. So if the projections are right, or even if they're close to right, you think about, well, what's happening over the next few years is you have a significant number of people that have a lot of experience at the mill. And I see this a lot. I'll go into a mill, and a lot of times if I'm doing an all population training of some sort, and it doesn't matter if it's 100 people or 700 people, a lot of times I'll see 30 to 40% of the population in the mill looks like they've been here a long time. 30 years, 40 years, some of them 50 years. And then I'll see 30 or 40% of the population that looks like they've been here less than 5. I mean, 5 years, 6 years, 8 years, just still young in the career. Now, if you've got 30, 40% that have less than 10 years experience and 30 or 40% that have more than 30, 40 years experience, that doesn't leave very much in the middle to help identify and prepare. How do we get them ready for leadership? So here's the big kickers today. When you look at retention rates, and I'm just using industry as a standard, if you look what it says at the top about age between 18 and 40, that was considered the first half of somebody's career. When someone came out of school, right, whether it was high school, trade school, college, and we go all the way back to 1960, that person's first job, the average length of employment, as you can see on the chart, was 23 and a half years. Look where it is today. And it's been around 2 for a long time, ever since almost when you see the 2003 at 2.3, it's kind of just bounced around a 2-year figure. So we're really not talking about just preparing for a succession plan. It's really talking about how do you not just attract the talent, how do you keep the talent and get them prepared? Because if we're experiencing turnover at the rate most organizations are experiencing turnover in their younger populations, it's almost the same scenario of it's like rent an employee, right? It's just like rent versus buying a home. You know, sometimes people have to do that, but you end up in a situation where there's never a return on investment. Now, here's what has come to be. I study exit surveys. I always have to know, why are people leaving organizations today? And when you look at the young populations who we're bringing in and we're asking them to do much more responsible things than what we'd have asked someone at their same age 20 years ago. But if you look at the young populations and you survey, why did they leave? There's 2 things that stand out loud and clear that what they're saying to organizations. The first one is they leave because they don't think their company cares. That is number 1 on the feedback. And I'm not talking about when they leave for another dollar down the street or when they get transferred to somewhere else because a spouse got moved somewhere and they wanted to go with them. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when they leave because they didn't like it. The second piece of feedback, and listen to this one, manufacturers, I'm leaving because I don't like the way my supervisor, and there's 2 words they use interchangeably, either talks or treats me. Now, that is a significant difference from way back when. So we're not just talking about succession development and who do you have and are they ready? We're oftentimes talking about once you get them ready, are they going to stay? And so a big part of what we're really looking at is what is the difference between what we're asking supervisors to do out on the floor as they manage all those frontline activities, and do we have them ready for a manager's role when they start getting into things that are much more complicated? Now, and this has been true for a long time. You know, just look at the comparison between supervisor and manager. Supervisor, very concrete job, right? It's a well-defined description of what a supervisor does, where the manager, a lot more abstract, a lot more ambiguous, much simpler people skills than the supervisor side versus the manager having to use a lot more complex skills, simpler influence skills. We didn't have to use influence years ago, right? That wasn't part of the process. It's much more complex today. You know, many of you dialing in, if you've been around the mills for a long time, you, like me, and I saw a few names on there that I know can certainly attest to this. I can remember a time in the facilities when positive feedback meant nobody was yelling at you. If you've been around for a while, you remember those days that if your superintendent walked by and didn't say something, you knew everything was thumbs up. It's not like that today. That's a part of that feedback of why younger team members are leaving, because they don't like the way supervisors treat them. So here's what that means. What that means is this: whoever is managing your organization today is really creating the brand of what your organization represents to these younger populations. It's not what it says in your mission statement or what your value statement says. Just like a brand for a customer, it's really about what we do. And so there's lots of organizations today that when you look at how strong is our cultural chain within the organization, you can have one individual within that organization that can be an absolute culture killer if we're not careful. So a part of that training and development is oftentimes taking your most experienced managers, taking your most experienced leaders that you have out there on the floor, and making sure that we got everybody aligned on how do we continue to grow team members within the organization. So clear power relationships, complex power relationships, few stakeholders, many stakeholders, and it goes many times when you roll from a supervisor to a leader, a manager, it goes from a functional style to a strategic kind of a deployment. So, lots of things to consider when you look at the differences there. What I'd encourage you to do, and you're welcome to use this, there's lots of them out there. I'm just trying to give you some examples of tools today. If you're not already taking a look at what you need to do to transition people, you've certainly got to have some sort of a competency evaluation. And you got to decide within that evaluation, what is it that we're trying to measure? Used to, it was experience. Oftentimes, I remember a friend of mine on the East Coast that worked in a mill, and somehow he went from maintenance superintendent to HR. I don't know how you get from maintenance to HR, but he did. And he came into a training one day, and his name was Richard, and I was just chatting with Richard, having a good time. And I said, Richard, what have you been doing lately? He said, I've been writing a book. I said, Richard, I didn't even know you could read. That's good. What's your book about? He said, non-traditional work systems. And I said, non-traditional work systems? What's the title? He said, non-traditional work systems. I said, Richard, who's going to buy a book called non-traditional work systems? And I started picking on Richard, just having a good time. And there was about 10 other people in the room, maybe 12, and they started picking on Richard. So he finally turned to them and said, well, what would you call the book? And they all got to picking on Richard. Well, when they got done, he had renamed his book, and it was called Please Die, I Want a Promotion. And you can Google up Please Die, I Want a Promotion, and Richard's book will come up. But what he was saying back then was, back in the old days, the person in front of you had to either kick the bucket or retire before you had a chance to move up. And succession processes moved very slow back then, which means because the succession process moved slowly, that means wisdom and preparedness was very high. People stayed in their jobs a lot longer. When I look in the mills today and I see a 20-something-year-old person or a 30-something-year-old person, and you look at the roles they have, in my generation, we never would have got there in the 20s or 30s. It would have been much more in the 40s and the 50s. So we're asking our younger people to do much more responsible things with a lot less life experience than what we would have had 20, 30 years ago. The number one complaint I hear in the mills and in the plants is that we got people that don't know what to do and training people that don't know what they're doing. So my point is, find you a tool that could be like this, but it really starts to identify what are you trying to measure. And you could look at, for an example, this is asking on a scale of 1 to 5 is what's important and what's not important. And if it's on a 5 scale, it says it is a very important area for superior performance. You've got to discern what are those things that you expect from your leadership, and then starting to define that, just like we define a product mix and just like we define the market. We have to be looking at succession development the same way. So this tool or something like it, but you got to certainly identify what your target is. Then you got to look at, well, how do I find candidates? Now, simple tool, but look at how the tool is designed. It's really talking about a needs base. Like in 5 years, all your boomers are going to be moving out of the workforce. So you might want to be thinking about, well, how many of those do I have in the workforce? And how many do I have in the leadership team? And then start thinking about, well, the positions, how many people are going to be needed? What's the reason they're leaving? And if it's a boomer, it's probably retirement, right? But so you'll have some reasons identified. And then take a look at your candidates, right? Your group one, what we call your potential candidates. Now, we always feel like your top tier candidates are somewhere between ready right now and up to 3 years away, right? Some teams use 0 to 2, but 0 to a couple of years. 0 would indicate you could put them in the role today and find out who they are, how many years would they be to be qualified, position that they currently have, month and year identified. And then your group 2 is people that are out a little further than that. It might be a new hire that you've just brought in that shows tremendous potential, everybody's excited about, but they got no time in the saddle. And this will change a little through the years, but you got to be going through your management forecasting of what you're going to need way before the storm hits, right? This is not last minute preparation kind of stuff. And we're almost at the last minute now. I mean, when you talk about the scale of what it takes to really get organizations ready. So assessing candidates, I'm going to give you an example of things that we do. We use some assessment tools that help us understand, are they going to be someone that can handle the expectations and the competencies that we're going to ask them to handle? So we use a tool called Workplace Big Five. It looks at 55 different leadership competencies, and it won't tell us whether someone's good or bad. It's going to tell us what turns them on at work and what turns them off at work. But my point is, you got to be using something that is much more predictable than a coin flip, right? Some absolutes. Now, Workplace Big Five, I'll give you an example. We use this tool all the time in leadership coaching. If I look in there and I look at the first scale that we're going to measure, and they have what we call a worry scale, and I see that this is a real worrier, and the second scale is an anger scale, and it tells me when they do get upset, how often do people around them know that they're frustrated or mad. So if I end up with a high worrier and someone that's got a temper scale that's a little off the chart to the right, and then I go look at a scale that's called tact, and tact is very low, that is almost a guarantee that when they get under pressure, they're going to have to walk back things that they said or did. Now, if we're solving problem number one by creating problem number 2 and 3, I promise you, without coaching, that individual is not going to fix that on their own. My point is, instruments like that can help you identify areas where people are going to need to develop, and you can identify them way before they actually get into the workforce or into the role that you're preparing them for. We use a DISC profile. I don't know if I bet you a lot of you are familiar with DISC. It looks at communication styles. DISC comes off an old Myers-Briggs kind of a platform, where Myers-Briggs is a great tool to use, and DISC is too. It's 2 of the most validated on the market, but DISC tells you a lot about how someone communicates. What's interesting, and always has been extremely interesting to me, is when I do a leadership assessment on a group of leaders, I will find out in DISC that their leadership is usually going to be what we call high D, high C, which is just a redneck term for double hard-headed. When I go look at the production team, not the maintenance team, but the production team, I'm going to find 60 to 70% of that production team is what we call high S, high C. Now, I'm not going to get big into DISC, but here's the challenge, right? The common ground is C, which means everybody wants it right. The big difference is how we communicate. D's communicate entirely different than S's. And so if you don't look at change management, how do we manage upset condition? If you don't know your team, then there are going to be times when communication is going to break down naturally. And let me tell you about communications. If you're not working at it, I promise you they're broke. You got to be working at communications for communications to run well in a team. And the bigger you get, the more complicated it becomes. So use some tools like DISC or things like that to identify. 360 feedback, great tool. I would run that on every leader in facility. Now, don't do them all at the same time, because you'll end up clogging up your email stream and everybody will filling out a survey. But your most critical leaders that you have within the facility, 360s give them feedback on how they see themselves compared to the people they serve. And that could be employees, that could be coworkers, that could be bosses, that could be others, but we surround them. That's why it's called 360 with feedback. So I love 360s. If I've got a leader that's having a hard time really utilizing respectful skills, being able to influence the team, I'm going to use a 360 as a measurement tool. And I'm going to go to the leader and say, part of your expectation is at the end of the year, we're going to take another 360, and I want to see you be able to move the needle in this particular area. You're going to find some of your best succession candidates have wonderful knowledge of your processes, your mills, your plants. But if they can't get others influenced and use their natural leadership skills in a positive way, then it's going to be difficult for them to ever tap into those potentials they have. So 360s help identify that. Annual reviews is certainly a part of it. You know, if you're an organization that does these annual, then you're kind of meeting a minimum standard. Twice a year would be even better. So you get things called assessment centers. This is just part of our puzzle. When I get someone or a pool of people that are about ready to take on a plant role, leadership role, or maybe a regional manager kind of a role, we typically like putting together what we call an assessment center that throws them into, they've nicknamed it a day in hell in your boss's shoes. And it's a bad day. They go through sexual harassment complaints and angry neighbors complaining about what's happening at the plant. And then they have media show up on site. They got to announce a salary for, it's just a bad day. But we do that so that we can see, are they prepared to handle those kind of things? And then we also have others who are attending that, doing some feedback or some observations as they go through so they can provide feedback. And what's interesting about the dynamic of an assessment center is the people who are participants in year one become assessors in year two. So they go from learning, how do you deal with those kind of things and get ready, and what do we know about this individual's knowledge of the company and their skill set, to the next year giving feedback to others who they are preparing, and so it becomes a perpetual, almost developing leaders. That has really risen the bar in a number of companies. And then any sort of a proficiency review. It gives a person an opportunity to look at what's working and what's not. But whatever your puzzle looks like, it can't be anymore people just standing in line, right? If it's who's next and who's been here the longest, you're going to struggle with a lot of the turnover issues that we see in so many of the organizations today. So when you're building out your developmental activities, you know, they need to be skills-based activities. It needs to be things where people can get exposure to the bigger picture in an organization, special project teams, outside training sources, but you need to certainly be individualized in the development. What I need to move to the next level in leadership may be completely different than what you need. So if we're both working off the same plan, one of us getting better results than the other. So some of it's going to be common ground. You know, you got to develop common language within an organization. So sometimes we got to go to the same kind of training, and that's cool. But when you're really developing someone, that is specifically about what they need. And if you don't have the pieces to the puzzle back here, then it's hard to understand the individual differences that someone may need to get there. So years ago, Peter Drucker, who I still use this because it absolutely hit home when he said it, and it hits home today. It takes far more energy to improve from incompetence to mediocrity than to improve from first-rate performance to excellence. What that means is this: when you're building your team, your succession team, your A players on your team do not want to play ball with C and D players, right? Your first-rate performers expect everybody to perform like they do. That's why hiring and selection is so important in the organization. If you hire and train a loser, someone that's not going to make it in your organization, at the end of that whole process, you put a lot into it, and what you got is a trained loser. So my point is, pick first rate, pick core values, pick the things that really get someone into your world and they're excited about what they do. Now, they need to be real work experiences. That's a driver for leadership. It doesn't need to be something that you just ask them to do to fill time. So you can create these things, but you got to get creative with it. That's why we want a team of people really coming in and being able to say, let's think through what are some of those structured experiences that would be key drivers for someone to develop the skills and knowledge that they need. And remember, those people who are coming into those roles today are coming in at 20s and 30s, they don't have the 10, 15, 20, 30 years of experience. So you're working with someone that doesn't have that much time in the saddle in terms of experience. It's not like the old days where time was on our side. But it's got to be a real scope of work. It's a developmental activity that will stretch that individual. What might be routine to some may not be routine to them at all. And it doesn't need to be just go paint the flagpole, and when you get done with that, let me know. It's got to be something that's got some teeth in it, something that when they come back, they've taken ownership of a new awareness or a new skill set. And again, it could be routine to somebody else, but certainly it would be significant for them. You got to identify what those things could be. Now, if you understand your target, right? If you understand the competencies that they're needing to develop, and it could be a number of things, but if you understand all that, then all of a sudden these become individualized versus just a group dynamic. So structure the plan. If you can answer these questions, you normally got a pretty good plan. What is the specific areas of development or enhancement? How will this have a positive impact on his or her effectiveness? What specific activities are you going to ask them to undertake or do? And then, what specific elements of the real work project would develop in this chosen area? That's the kind of questions we need to be asking to figure out, have we got the right opportunity? When will they occur? What support is he or she going to need, and from whom? What additional resources, if any, are they going to need? How will they progress and master? How will that be determined? And how will he or she apply the skill and ability on the job? Again, if you can answer the last couple of questions on these PowerPoints, then that tells you whether you got a great individual plan. So it's got to be somewhat structured, but certainly targeted to the individual. Once someone has an IDP, we don't do a once a year meeting. We do quarterly meetings. You got to review the plan. What's going on? What do they need? Sometimes at group sessions, maybe you got 2 or 3 different candidates that you're working with. Bring them into a meeting, do a lunch and learn with them, bring in a bologna sandwich and talk about some of the development areas that they're going through. A lot of times that engagement will help take it to another level. Readiness evaluations by the manager, HR department, senior management, they got to be given feedback. And I like to see it quarterly. That way there's no surprises at the end of the year. If the expectations are to grow, then you've got to have these assessments to be able to say, you're gaining ground in this area or you're not. And promotions, reassignments is dictated by company. That's part of a team member's performance area. And when you look at, are they willing to do what it takes to move to that next step? It's an ongoing process, right? If you view it as an HR program, then I'm not picking on HR. This has got to be driven from the most senior managers in the organization. Right? It's not one that you can delegate. I can't tell you how many times we come into a training, and if we come in and don't have a senior leader there who's saying, gang, here's why you're here. It's not about introducing me or a trainer. It's about introducing to the team that's attending what's the expectations of what the importance. When that's tied together, then all of a sudden these things matter. That's why you can't delegate this. This has got to be a hands-on task. And in assessment teams, 2 heads are better than 1, 3 is better than 2. The more people you get engaged in this, typically the better it turns out. So here's some of the results. You end up with a qualified pool of candidates. That's interesting because that will increase versus decrease. Those involved are engaged because of this. You're going to see things happening with their development, and they sense a self-worth and recognition, which is exactly what these younger populations are looking for quickly. They want to be engaged. But if the only feedback they're getting is when something's broke, they don't like that opportunity. They perceive this opportunity, the sense they're valued, the company cares about their growth. I mean, all of these things start to really come to a surface. It fits into one of the biggest issues facing companies, which is about retaining the best and the brightest. Those involved are excited. And I tell you what I've seen it do for companies. I've seen companies absolutely raise the bar on development. And it was not a negative. It ended up being a positive to everybody else. It's a culture change element that will happen for the better when you start really creating a solid succession program. So you got to have what we call individual development plans. And this is just an example. You probably have some in your organization that are similar, but if I come into your organization and I say, well, show me, Joe Promotables or Jane Promotables development plan, and I need to see something that's similar to this, right? What job title are they currently in? What's the target job? I need to know the years of service. I want to be able to look at something that tells me that we've evaluated this individual from an overview format, and we can look at development activities, things like their job knowledge proficiency or their management proficiency, and some of the developmental timeframes and activities that we're going to do. Significant positions, and even in big organizations, I oftentimes are not able to find this in one document. So my point is, it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be just like some of the things that you see right here that certainly matter and make a difference. Now, that process is really getting into the opportunity of making sure that that you've got your teams prepared. You know, I was up in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and this has been before COVID, but we were in the training room and I'm doing a presentation leadership program, and the bulb starts to go out in the viewer. It starts to turn purple, so everything on the screen you can't read. And I said to Eric, the coordinator, I said, Eric, we're going to need to get that bulb changed at it break because I got a lot of presentation to get through. And he said, I already got that handled. So we took a break. About 10 minutes later, in walks this old electrician that looked like he had been at the mill for a long time. He had to be very close to retirement. He crawls up on that ladder. It's probably a 12-foot ceiling. And the first thing this old electrician does is whoop out a Phillips head screwdriver and go to pulling panels off this viewer. And he is having a hard time finding access to where that bulb is located in the viewer. So he finally looks down. There's about 20 of us in the class. And he said, anybody got a manual on this thing? And nobody said anything. Nobody had a manual. But he was under pressure. Everybody's watching him. So he goes back to pulling off panels, and he's struggling. And I watched a young man sitting not 10 feet to his left pull up his telephone. And I could not count to 10 before this young man had already pulled up a YouTube on that exact viewer. And he turned that YouTube around to that old timer up on that ladder. And he said, sir, here's the access door to that bulb. And that electrician was offended by that. He said, I don't need instructions on how to change a light bulb. And so he fiddled around for a few more minutes and was still under pressure and still had not been successful getting to that compartment that contained the bulb. And he finally looked down at that young 25-year-old and said, let me see that one more time. And that young man was very polite and respectful and showed it to him when he got the bulb changed. Now, my point being this, that electrician in the mill probably knew every piece of equipment out there like he should. He probably knew it inside and out. I bet he had never changed a bulb in a viewer because they're complicated. But you know what? I bet you a young man never changed the bulb in the viewer too. Now, where the old timer went to relying on experience, which he didn't have any of on that viewer, the young man knew where to go get that information. My point is, in your succession development and how you change an organization, that answer is going to be somewhere in the middle. You certainly got to be changing a lot of how we do business today. But how do we get that young population for roles to be able to take on? They're going to be significantly younger than what that same role would have been 10, 15, 20 years ago. So we're asking them again to do things that are well beyond their years of experience, and we're asking them to do them right with a lot more expectations today. So with that, I'm hoping that what we do is just jar a few thoughts for you, give you a few tools, and they don't have to be tools like this. They can be anything that still accomplishes that purpose. But that give you some ideas of things that organizations are doing today that help them not just get this thing started, but how do they get it started and feed it? Because if you don't feed it now, it's not too many years before that experience is going to be walking out of the mill, and it'll be a tough day without that level of experience being transitioned to others. So I say all that, we're about the end of presentation time. I'm going to turn it back to Kayla. And Kayla, you may have had some questions that came up, so I'm going to turn it back to you.
All right. Hi, Thomas. So we do have a couple questions that came in. So first of all, someone is wanting a copy of that first chart you showed with the graph phasing out the generations.
Okay.
If you would be able to provide that. The second
Absolutely.
question we had, go ahead.
Say absolutely, no problem.
Great. So the second question we have is, how can you tell that someone is answering those assessment questions, trying to give you answers that they think is what you want to hear? For example, in the DISC, you can tell more or less what the assessment is trying to determine.
So is the question about, Kayla, you think someone might be able to manipulate like a DISC? They give you an answer you want to hear versus what they are?
Yes.
That is a possibility, but that's the reason that we use a multitude of tools. And look, not very often do I get somebody that has manipulated a DISC. Every once in a blue moon, I do. But if you know that person that, for an example, if they're already in the workforce, you already got some behavioral observations on them. The one individual I'm thinking of that I think did manipulate it, he went into it and everything that he was asked, he put the opposite of what he is. And when I got done with that, I said, the instrument misses every once in a while, but I feel like this is a big miss for you. And his supervisor was sitting in there, we're going through the same thing. And the supervisor said, I agree. And the guy finally admitted that he just took it as a joke. Now, there were 19 other people that went through it and didn't do that at all. So we politely asked the individual to redo it, and we ended up with a much more accurate profile. When you get to hiring and selection, you can't make a hiring selection based off of personality. Now, it can tell you a lot about how they would communicate with the team, but just be careful how you use that. You'll want to consult with your HR team about how to use a DISC, or even for an example, a workplace Big Five. Those are both, in my opinion, handy tools to have, and it gives you insight into what you're going to get. But you still have to have a great hiring and selection process, right? It can't be a coin flip. So I hope I answered that. If I didn't, I'll be glad to tee that up again if they'd like more information a little bit later.
Okay, and the next question I have is, everyone wants to be a leader. What can you say about the qualities of those that are great followers? Leaders without excellent followers is an oxymoron.
Yeah, that is true. And we see that in interview and selection sometimes. We strive to have others that want to continue to develop, but every once in a while, you're going to find someone that finds their niche in life, and if you mess it up, then you're probably going to have an underperformer. So knowing that you're going to have a group of followers, the question is, when the leaders lead, are the followers following? And see, that's going to be based upon influence skills. It's not like it used to be. You think about, for an example, if you go back and you came up with 2 or 3 words that describe what a leader was all about and how they communicated 30, 40 years ago, you're going to find that they had excellent job knowledge and skills. Most of them could tell you that they started their experience with a shovel or working with a pit that they had to go get into, but it was they learned from the ground up. Today, when you look at young leaders or any leader, your list went from 3 or 4 things they had to have 20 years ago to 30 or 40 things we expect them to do today. So now all of a sudden, a leader 20 years ago who had no tact whatsoever, but was able to get more product out the door because they barked orders and pointed fingers, but they stayed on the job site 24/7. That same leader today, if they behave the same way, you're dealing with 800 calls all day long. That's why tact matters today and influence skills matter today. So great question. It is really about, some people are going to decide to be a follower, and that's A-okay. That's a wonderful answer. But you also got a leader, when they look over the shoulder, are they able to influence those others to be at their best? Your leadership population does their best work under pressure. Usually your production teams do their worst work under pressure. So when a leader just does what's natural, oftentimes they see errors and injuries go up if they're not thinking about the people they serve, and that would be that production team. Now all of a sudden that may matter how we communicate. So good question.
Great. So they did say you answered it very well, and that's what they were looking for. So the next question we have is, what is the key driver to get everyone on the same page to drive change? Having difficulty to negotiate time to cover leadership competencies because managers don't have time.
Yeah. And that is the $1,000,000 question of the day. As busy as we are, how do you find time? Now, I'm going to answer that, and it's almost a sarcastic answer. It's the what happens if we don't. You got to find time for it, because a year or 2 later, it's going to be harder then than it is now. But to get everybody on the same page, in my opinion, and what we do a lot, is you take a leadership team and you create a development strategy, right? It's almost like it is part of your business plan. If we were doing a strategic planning process, development would be one of the chapter titles in your development plan. But a lot of organizations today are breaking that down even further, and they're having a strategic safety plan. They have a strategic development plan, and they're no longer doing 3 years and 5 years and 10 years out. They're doing 1 year at a time, and they've got to get everybody on the same page. So my suggestion is run it kind of like a business strategy where you get your key decision makers together and decide, you know, what is our goal in development and what are going to be some of those things that are going to be business norms in our area of progression. And you can decide those things and then apply it that way. And it's not too difficult. It's a matter of investing that time. But I'm not talking about days away in the woods with no whistles or bells or cell phones. I'm talking about sometimes just taking a half day and getting away from the mill and being able to really think through one of those targets. So another great question.
Okay, well, I don't have any questions after that. If anyone has anything more, please put it in our question box and we'll be happy to answer it. But while I'm waiting for that, I would like to say that once this webinar is ended, there will be a survey that will pop up in your inbox. Please go ahead, especially our manufacturers, please go ahead and answer that survey. It really helps us to tailor our content to see what you need. You know, we really are glad that we can offer these webinars to you just for informational purposes. And then, of course, if you should need anything after this, you know, we can definitely get with you and set that up. And but it really does help us to see what your needs are and go from there. I have a question here. Where will the YouTube page be located? I can send out that information, but also if you go on YouTube and you Google MEPOL, MEPOL, we should pop up, and all of our videos, as well as all of our webinar recordings will be there. But for this individual person, I can send you that link individually once I get it up. Okay, no problem. Any more questions? All right, well, I don't see any more coming through to the answer to the question box. Thank you all for attending. We really do appreciate it. Like I said, please go ahead and answer that survey for us so we can get, you know, some more relevant information out to you guys. And other than that, please contact me if you should need anything, especially if you need, you know, any services from Thomas's presentation today. I can put you in touch with them and we can get that going for you. So thank you, everyone. We appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you.